my name is Leah. Today I wanted to sit down and talk a little bit about exposition, which doesn't sound like a very fun topic, but it's something that I am fascinated by, and it's something that I know a lot of people struggle writing. I mean, I struggle writing it myself, but I feel like I have some stuff to say that might be helpful. Exposition is difficult to write naturally because it involves a lot of things that you have to balance whenever you're writing it. So I'm just gonna jump right in. We're gonna talk about what is good exposition, and then I'm going to give some tips on how to write it well based off of my own experience and methods that I use. According to Wikipedia, narrative exposition is the insertion of background information within a story or narrative. This information can be about the setting, characters' backstories, prior plot events, historical context, etc. In literature, exposition appears in the form of expository writing embedded within the narrative. So, by definition, exposition isn't bad, even though it's something that a lot of us use as a negative critique of our own or other works. It's a necessary part of writing in order to convey information to the reader. Even if you're not writing fantasy, every book has at least some level of character backstory or world information about that particular setting that needs to come across to the reader. What gives exposition a bad name is when it's noticeable. When the reader realizes, oh, this is the author telling me information. It's our job as authors to suck the reader into the story and make them feel like this is a real world with real characters and real happenings, goings on. So whenever the exposition comes across as, oh, the author is giving me information, it takes the reader out of the story and it breaks the illusion that they are experiencing a real world. A lot of people will call this suspension of disbelief, and I think it goes a little bit further than that as well, because you can have information that is believable, but if it's not written in a way that blends with the narrative, it's going to be jarring to the reader and take them out of the experience. So, based on all that, we know it's our goal to keep the reader in the work. How do we do it? That is the question. The first thing I think we need to do is consider what makes exposition well written or not. Obviously, this is a little bit subjective because what takes one reader out of the story might not take another reader out, but we're looking for what in general works. The way that I've come to think about writing exposition is to picture it on a scale that represents how closely that information is being tied to the narrative. Jumping aside for just a moment, by narrative I mean the forward action of the story. It's the cause and effect, the actions of the characters that either drive them forward or have consequences later on. This, in my opinion, is the core thread of a story, and all the other writing elements kind of weave around that thread, sometimes distancing off of it, sometimes bringing us back, but that core is what drives the story forward. So when I say the narrative, that is what I'm talking about, that core element of the story. So with this scale, we measure how closely the delivery of this exposition gets us to the core narrative. On one end, the delivery is completely separate from the narrative. Maybe it's a footnote or an external insertion of information. It has nothing to do with the characters, the plot, anything. It's an outside force telling information within the book. On the other end, maybe it's as closely tied to the narrative as you can get. The delivery is prompted by something that happens in the narrative, and then the delivery itself causes something else. If you took the delivery of that out, it completely disrupts the flow of the narrative. Brandon Sanderson talks about this in his class Writing for Science Fiction and Fantasy, where he is talking about how to tell the reader about your magic system, which also is a type of exposition, and he uses a similar illustration.
One thing you could do is include an encyclopedia entry on the magic word game. That's your worst choice. Choice number 2 is to have the characters sit and talk about the magic and get it explained. That's still a pretty bad choice, but at least it's moved to dialogue, right? Choice number 3 is let's go out and have the character experiment and make it, and having problems making it work, and the teacher instructing them. And that works pretty well in the book. In the screenplay, I don't have time for that, and it would work less well on screen. So what did I do is I combined that scene and the scene also early in the book where Kelsier sneaks into House Venture to steal a bead of adium, right? And in the movie version, these are the same scene. Vince followed him. She's like, you promised to train me? He's like, all right, baptism by fire, come with me, and we're going to try these different things while we're robbing these people.
The thing with sliding scales, though, is that there's not a line at any point which denotes, oh, everything on this side is bad and everything on this side is good. That piece of exposition that you're trying to deliver And how you do that and where that falls on the scale is going to depend on what the story requires and what that information even is. For example, it's a lot easier to put a little small piece of information on this side where you don't really have to tie it closely to the narrative, like telling the reader we're entering the town Brookville. I can just have them read the sign, "Welcome to Brookville," as they walk in. It's not necessarily like completely external, but it's still on this end of the scale where we're just like reading a piece of information essentially. So the question obviously then becomes, how do you know where to place the delivery on the scale? And my answer brings me back to Brandon Sanderson. I just enjoy the way he explains things very much. Sanderson has what he calls Sanderson's 3 laws of writing magic systems, and the first one is this: an author's ability to solve conflict satisfactorily with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. I think this rule applies to our exposition problem as well. If a piece of information is irrelevant to the overarching story as a whole, it can be on this side of the scale. If a piece of information is incredibly important, say a core piece of the character's backstory, the world's political structure, because that structure is an important part of the climax or an important part of the character's arc, then that information is going to be delivered in a way that's more closely tied to the narrative, because it does have an effect on the cause and effect of the whole story. So, reworded from Sanderson's law, the law of exposition then is: a piece of exposition's importance to the narrative is directly proportional to how closely it should be tied to said narrative in the writing. Okay, so we know what exposition is, we know where it should be placed on the scale of importance to the narrative, but how do we actually go about writing the exposition? How do we go about the delivery? There are 4 main things that I consider whenever I'm writing exposition. First, I ask, what does the reader need to know? This is somewhat obvious, I know, but it gives us a baseline to consider what does the reader actually need versus what do I just want to include so that my research doesn't go to waste. I write fantasy, so I feel like this is a trap that many of us in this genre fall into. We don't want our world building to go to waste because we've put so much effort into it, but does the reader really need all of that in order to understand the overall narrative? No. What does the reader need in order to make the narrative clear and the ending satisfying? On the flip side, you can ask yourself, can the reader go without knowing this? Taking a second to really consider these questions will help refine the exposition so that you don't accidentally bog it down with peripheral details. The second question that I ask myself is, what does the character delivering the exposition know? Again, this feels like an obvious one, but asking this question up front will help us avoid accidentally letting a plot hole slip in or imparting our own knowledge as the author onto a character who shouldn't know that thing. Like the character in a crime mystery whose alibi is that they were at home the night of the murder is also not going to have seen the prime suspect walking around in the alleyway. This also goes not just for characters, but whatever the source of the information is. If you're in a building with security cameras, there's a fixed point at which those security cameras are looking, minus the whole ones that swivel and move around, I know. But even those have like physical limitations with what they do. If something happens outside of what that source knows, it cannot give the reader or the main character that information. The third question is where I think it gets very fun, because it deals with how exposition relates to point of view. So next I ask, what is the point of view character's familiarity with the information? If they're hearing it from someone else, have they heard it before, or is it something completely new? If it's something they already know and is an innate part of the world, why are they thinking about it in this moment? There are a lot of things about just day-to-day life and culture that we don't really think about, they just are. We're not consciously considering them, which is why when a character is a part of and familiar with their surroundings, it feels weird when they just start thinking about the political structure of their nation or the past 200 years of history. We don't just do that randomly. Some of this will also depend on if you're writing like first person versus third person. If you're writing third person, is the narrator limited or omniscient? Because the closer the narration is to the character's point of view, the more closely it needs to be tied to how and why the character is thinking about that information. The familiarity problem is why we get the unknowing outsider trope as a main character, because it's a lot more natural to explain a new world to a character who's apart from it than it is to someone who's already in that world. And the reader is already an outsider, so it's a natural way to give the reader the right information if you're also explaining it to an unknowing outsider within the book. The fourth question I ask after I've figured out how familiar the character is with this new information is, how does the point of view character feel about the information? They don't have to have like a visceral reaction to every single bit of information that they have, but having the character not react at all is in itself an answer to this question. Is it shocking, normal, confusing, revolting? Their feelings or lack of feelings about the information is going to color the reader's perspective on that information as well, help characterize your point of view character, and convey a sense of importance or unimportance about that information. Maybe a sense of unimportance about something can help hide foreshadowing. By extension, is the character open about their reaction, or do they keep it to themselves? This is another way to characterize your point of view character, but it's also a tool for exposition. If a character feels like reacting a certain way would gain them favor or put them in danger, that also tells us something about the world. It's important to know what the point of view character does or doesn't feel about a particular piece of information to avoid having them react in a way that's contradictory to what they actually are like, which again is another thing that pulls the reader out of the story. It feels forced. It doesn't feel like it's an actual perspective or emotion that comes from the character itself. It feels like the author is trying to tell the reader how to feel about that thing. For example, if my point of view character is afraid of heights and my world is a floating city above the earth, their description of that is going to be tinged with anxiety and fear, not like whimsical wonder, which could be another way to write that setting. In conclusion, exposition is about clearly communicating information to the reader while also balancing character perspective and point of view. I hope that this video has been helpful. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I feel like it's one of the areas that I have a good enough grasp on that I actually had like something to say about it, so I wanted to sit down and make this video. Let me know below what you thought about my advice or if you have any other tips to help with exposition. It can be an overwhelming thing sometimes to think about, so we can just have like a fun conversation about it in the comments. But that is all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye.